Welcome to the Enneagram with Chelsea and Nicole. Today we are talking about how to get started with the Enneagram, which is, I'm sure for many of you, a very, very exciting episode and also one you might be a little bit surprised at. Nicole, obviously you and I have had lots of conversations. You helped me get started with the Enneagram. I constantly am interfacing with people who, when I bring it up, I'm almost like I want to whisper it, or like maybe I shouldn't bring it up, because as we've been talking, the power of the Enneagram, it can be dangerous on some levels if it's not fully understood or not used, or to the extent which people mistype themselves or others. And so this is a really, really important topic to get right. And that's why we're taking the time to help people understand either where they can get started on their own journey, or if they've already gotten started on their journey and maybe they've already typed themselves or had experiences or read books or bumped up against different content, what they might be thinking about in terms of reframing it. So what's your best advice to people when they're first getting started?
Yeah, I am so glad we're talking about this because, as you just said, comes up all the time and is super important. And I'd say the first thing is do not take the test, which is the very first thing that everyone does. One, I think it's also super funny that I think Americans in our culture, we just love our tests, and particularly personality tests, but anything related to that, like we've seen over the years, any of these like fun tests, we just love it. The problem is the Enneagram is super complex and sophisticated, as I will repeatedly say over and over ad nauseum, and therefore it's not really possible for the test to be super accurate because it's such a nuanced system. And so the tests are really there as a place to start. If you're going to take the test, my recommendation is to read a book to get your bearings. So to read all of the 9 types and just to get an overview and an understanding of all of them, which many people do. But when you're trying to reach to find yourself, instead of reading the behaviors, which is what most people do. So, usually the sequence is people take the test and they go read about their type, and then they read all the other types because usually they're most fascinated to type their significant other. That's typically how it goes, or somebody really close to them, their children or their parents, something like that. And so they start reading. The problem is that usually what people take away are the behaviors, like, oh, 8s do this and 2s do this and 4s do that, or they don't do that, or they have this thing. So one of the biggest problems and the most important thing to remember as you're beginning is the Enneagram is not based on your behaviors. And this is contrary to other personality tools that are heavily, behaviors are heavily counted. The Enneagram, of course, everything involves everything, right? So our behaviors are absolutely involved. But how you know your type is actually not as much based on your behaviors as it is based on your core motivations, your core fears, and then I would say your core brilliances. The things that at your best is exceptionally phenomenal. And so these are the 3 areas: core fear, core drive, core brilliances. Not necessarily how you behave, even though it's in there, that's not what makes your type. And most of us, and the more well-developed we are, we take on all of the types in terms of behaviors. We can behave like any type that we want. And the more well-developed we are, we do, as a matter of fact. So when you're trying to locate your type, that's what you look for: your core fear, your core drive, and your core brilliances in terms of your reading what those are. And avoid taking the test unless you're using that as a place to start. I know, my teachers at the Enneagram Institute, they design the test to give you the top 3 that you fall into. And that's the reason why, is that if the top 3, those are the 3 that you should be looking at to, start your investigation. So that's kind of like the initial things. I'll add this, that Chelsea, that just so that it gives the perspective of how kind of not well this tends to go. In my experience, 8 out of 10 people mistype themselves. And they're very confident in their typing because they took the test or they read it. And what we don't really account for is that, one, the Enneagram is really exploring the depths of most of which we're not super conscious of, right? And so the other thing is that as we read, we are interacting with what we don't like and what we do like about our own humanity or the humanity of others. And so we're automatically biased. And so managing that bias will end up identifying with things or not identifying with things that are largely unconscious. So that that's a problem. And then I would say that 9 out of 10 times people mistype others. It's not easy to do because we're a little bit of all types. And because it is so nuanced that just because you're pulling out, 5 to 10, even to 20 things that you think, oh, this is what makes me my type. Well, other types can display those identical things. And if without knowing and understanding and doing the deep kind of learning, it's very, very easy to mistype yourself and others. So that's the intro.
I mean, any test that is self-proclaimed saying we probably won't be able to fully type you, right? Like in the test itself, and gives you, some guidance, some direction. But I always thought what was interesting, even through you typing me in our initial conversations, was that even you're 20 years of practicing this. I'm sure, how many people do you think if you feel open to sharing? Hundreds, right? Thousands.
Yeah.
And I remember you said, I think you could be and kind of gave an overview, and then you checked in with me, and it was really up to me, right, to validate that, to think about it, to feel it out. I've heeded your advice over the years, and to this day, I have not typed my spouse, who I've been with for 10 years, because I see a lot of behaviors. I experience different things. I wonder, I think I'm starting to get closer to understanding the core of the matter. For those people who you're closest to, you can start to, as you know them deeply, understand where these daily behaviors are coming from, like what's driving them. Because I think it's up to the own person's curiosity, maybe to read the core fears and the core desires, to see what resonates with them, and not walk around, with a scarlet letter on their forehead or something, like you've been told you're this thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And something else that I say is a big indicator of the accuracy of whatever you're hearing or reading or observing around the Enneagram in general is if you're hearing somebody speak or you're reading something about a type and that type doesn't sound absolutely freaking inspiring. If you're not inspired by what you're experiencing, what you're hearing of that type, in terms of the description of it, and I'm talking about in a general description of the type, then that they don't have it right. So when you're talking about average behaviors or where we disintegrate or our stress responses or, certain particulars, well, sure, there's going to be a lot of very uninspiring parts of humanity. But what I want to make clear here is that when you're actually discussing in general, each type, it's important that we start from what the core type is designed to do. And every single one of them are fucking phenomenal. And should be what we actually are aspiring to be. So at our best, every type is amazing. And in many ways, like has supernatural powers, that are just inspiring. So if you're learning about a type and you're reading a type, it's difficult because we're talking about the spectrum of what any individual could be, which is, complicated and contextual. And so that's tricky. And what's even more tricky, which I'll add, which is really important to consider, is that a lot of people will focus on the levels of development. And I do not. That just needs to be contextual. It's too complicated. But one thing to consider is that no matter how, let's say, well-developed we are, or maybe how even disintegrated we are, we can exist in a really integrated state and literally 2 minutes later be absolutely disintegrated into a horrible place. That's what it means to be human. So when we're talking about, how well-developed we are, how, well-adjusted we are, it's about how long we are consistently in a place. And really how I measure it, which I've talked about this before, is how quickly we recover. It's not about disintegration. We're human. We're always going to disintegrate into, whatever it is, on any level, but it's how quickly we're able to recover and to return to a place of healthy, good, integrated states. So that makes it very difficult when we're reading about a type. And it's difficult to talk about humans in such generalities and get to any accuracy. And so these are things I think initially to keep in mind.
Yeah. When you talked earlier about core brilliance, it couldn't help but think of, a human's unique contribution that they have to make in the world. And when you're really integrated, it's really beautiful and really inspiring. So it's great to think about that. As people want to find resources, I know the Enneagram Institute has been a great website resource for me, and I know you've recommended it over the years. If you're not going to buy a book, but you just want to start reading about the types, primarily focused on the core fears and the core desires, is that a place where you'd send people?
I think it would initially. I mean, those were my teachers, and those are still, I think they're no longer actively teaching, as far as I know, in with the Enneagram Institute. But Riso and Hudson, and the wisdom of the Enneagram is really great. And then also Richard Rohr, who is a Jesuit priest. These are the two who I think brought the kind of complexity and the comprehensiveness of the Enneagram. They take it most into account. So those are, even though there are many, many good teachers, and I would say here's a distinction that I've noticed over time, is that you have some individuals who are very studied on the actual kind of intelligence of the Enneagram in terms of in general. Now, in particular humans, that becomes a different kind of skill, is that how are people in working with the Enneagram with particular individuals in terms of, helping people identify things in themselves and then creating strategies and practices that are very contextualized for each individual. And so this is, tricky. It just is. And so not everybody is good at everything. And so that's another thing to keep in mind, that there's different parts of the Enneagram and different parts of the practice, of the Enneagram that different teachers and leaders are better at than others. And so it's not, it's just, yeah, it's pretty expansive. And so it's kind of difficult to be good at everything.
Yeah. So we're back to, there is no one size fits all. And so if you feel frustrated with that, that's an invitation to keep listening. You're going to have more of that, because the invitation is not to send you on this prescriptive, path to check these 3 boxes on your to-do list. And now you know your type. That's just, it's diluting the power of the Enneagram to view it that way. And so I know, stick around, right? Keep listening. Nicole, we have actually gotten down to specific word choices in communication based on my type and based on those who I was communicating with. And so there is a lot of specificity. It's not to just say we're just going to stay broad and we're going to stay, loosey goosey. You can really nail this down, but you start with a really solid foundation, that core, have a really good partner. And then within the context of very specific situations, you can form extremely precise strategies that work, that are super resonant, because you have that framework in place. It just takes time. All right.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Chelsea. Excellent. It's exactly right. We want to start from, it's always a good place to start to understand the philosophy, the approach, the intention, the design of something before, and then work to specifics. And we can get incredibly specific, as you just said, beautifully said, with the Enneagram. But it also, there's an individual element, that we're, as humans, we're not limited to our type or even we're not only essentially a core driver, core fear. So our individualness is how we express our part of our design. And so these are very contextualized. And I think that to not acknowledge the very individuality of each person, even inside our core type, is to miss a lot. So I think you said it beautifully.
Awesome. Well, thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks, Nicole. It's been a great conversation and we welcome your input. So if you have questions, if this has piqued your interest in certain areas that you would love for us to have conversations about, please feel free to get in touch via LinkedIn. We would love to hear from you.